Okay. 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello and welcome to Media Watch on Hunger and Poverty. I'm your host, Bill Schickler, and today we're indeed honored to have an icon of the DC labor movement, someone who has been involved in organized labor for well over 35 years. And a good amount of that time, he was head of the D.C. Labor Council. And of course, I'm speaking of Josh Williams. Josh, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me here. It's indeed a pleasure to be on your show. Looking forward to really a really good program here.
Today, recently, our viewers may be aware that a strike that involved the Verizon workers nationwide, 39,000 workers went on strike for close to a month, and Josh was intimately involved in activities in the D.C. area and even on a nationwide basis in his communications with the Communication Workers of America and the International Brotherhood of Electricians. But in this first program, what we would like to do is sort of pay homage to the great work that Josh has done over the years in not only being a member of the labor movement, but a leader of the labor movement. And he's got a very well-informed insight into the issues that have shaped the labor movement over the decades, the obstacles we have, the victories, and what we can expect possibly in the future. So Josh, given that big mouthful, maybe you could tell us, you started off with one of the unions that are a member of the American, or the AFL-CIO. Maybe our younger members or viewers don't know what the AFL-CIO stands for. Could you tell them what that stands for?
Yes, for your listeners, they may consider this a mouthful. It's the American Federation of Labor, Congress of Industrial Organization. And it's an umbrella group consisting of 56 national and international unions. Now, the term international may be a little bit confusing to some of your listeners. What that term simply means is that the unions that are classified as internationals have members in Canada and the United States. The unions that are considered national unions are strictly unions that have members in the United States. So it is not that international unions have members all over the world.
Yeah.
We have not reached that point yet. Working up to it. One day we'll probably have unions that stretch globe to globe.
Well, I think that our viewers may have heard of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters.
That is correct.
And I think they're trying to get started in England, if I'm not mistaken.
You have had some dabbling between the British union and what you might call conversations between the British unions and the American unions. In fact, at one time, you may not be aware of this, there was a merger of what we now longingly called the hard metal unions, and it was a combination. There's discussion between the British unions and the American unions, and it started really with a discussion of merger between the machinists, the steel workers, and I think it was the UAW.
United Auto Workers.
And the auto workers, yes. That did not go very, very far. These leaders may have been a bit ahead of their times.
This is in the 1920s or so?
No, actually 30s? It was as late as probably about 15, 20 years ago.
Oh, okay.
Following that, there's been discussion between some of the American unions and the British unions, and there have been not official mergers, but certainly a relationship between
building in the process.
Yes, and that's I think that transcontinental unions will be a wave of the future, and it's only a matter of time before you have unions that are where members are global members rather than just national members, and where membership will not be defined by borders.
Yeah, that's good.
Just as capital is not defined by borders.
Right.
You don't have American capital and Mexican capital and Canadian capitals. You just have capital.
Right.
And it knows no borders. And at some point, workers are going to reach the point where their membership will also know no borders.
Is mobile like capital is.
Yeah, so and the CIO, coming back to your original question, the merger was between the craft unions, which were part of what is called the American Federation of Labor. That started, right? 1955 was the merger. Prior to that, you had one union, and it was primarily craft unions. Well, John L. Lewis, the head of the mine workers, thought that workers everywhere who needed to be organized should be organized and should not be organized by craft.
What time of period is this?
John Lewis started his in the 40s. Was when he started the Congress of Industrial Organization, and that became a separate federation.
During World War II, I guess.
World War II and into the 50s. In 55, you had a merger. Walter Reuther, the head of the UAW, the United Auto Workers, and then head of the CIO, and George Meany from the plumbers and head of the AFL-CIO brokered a merger and brought both federations together into one. I gather that there couldn't be an agreement on what the new name should be, so they just combined it, new names, AFL and CIO.
So the trade unions were, when people think of trade unions, you hear the term a lot maybe in your history books, or I hope, but trade unions were sort of more in the AFL.
The craft unions, they were the predecessors to the AFL-CIO, and most of the unions, there was a vision by some in the AFL-CIO that the AFL-CIO should represent everyone, both craft individuals and also what you might call blue-collar individuals who did not have a specific trade education. So they were not plumbers, they were not tobacco workers, they were not electricians, but might be garment workers, might be non-crafts.
So we have presently a whole bunch of unions within these unions, like the Carpenters Union, Bricklayers Union.
Carpenters is a national and international, and then you also have the plumbers, pipe fitters. You have the electricians. You have the elevator constructors, and you also have you have people who work in the grocery stores.
Right.
They have United Food and Commercial Workers.
Right.
You have government workers.
That's right.
You have
That's
state employees.
That's the biggest union now.
Actually, the biggest union are the public. If you merge all of the public unions together, they are the largest sector.
What are some of the names of
the American Federation of Government Employees is primarily a federal union, and that's AFGE. Then you have the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees.
That's
AFSCME. And they represent, as their name indicates, people who work in state government and municipal government. So that in your system, the postal workers are separate. You have the American postal workers, you have the national letter carriers, you have the firefighters. So you name it, and if they are employed by a state government or the federal government or municipal government, then they are considered public sector.
Now,
and then you have the private sector unions that are non-governmental unions.
Now, in a previous program in 2005, I interviewed Thea Lee, who is an economist and sort of risen in the ranks of the AFL-CIO organization. And she pointed out that there is a membership of 10 million people in unions today.
That is correct. And that does not include the National Education Association, So we're talking about the AFL-CIO. We're not talking about independent organizations. We're not talking like the National Education Association. You now probably, and then since 2005, you've also had the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, who broke
That's
away
right.
from the AFL-CIO, and they operate separately, though they do work on specific issues.
They meet
With their meet and work on issues. And I expect that this year, in the national elections, you are going to have all of the unions coming together, working together, because there is a realization that the interests of workers is something that is not defined by the tag that you have on the union card that says what union you belong to. If you're a worker, you're a worker. And your interests, all unions must represent the interests of working people, and not necessarily just the members of their particular union.
And it's been pointed out many times, like in Las Vegas, that they have a high percentage of union members, but the benefits accrue to most of the population of Las Vegas that are even non-union, because once the union power of collective bargaining has been established, even the people who don't like unions say, hey, they're getting good benefits, and it drops over. The businesses say, oh, it's not that bad to go along with our program, and as a result, the whole municipality benefits.
In fact, to that point, very, very same point, the mission of the American labor movement is to bring economic and social justice to the community. We're not just talking about what is good and right just for people who carry a card. We're talking about a movement that is designed and is around to help working families, we like to say, not union members, but working families. And that many of the issues which we legislatively fight for are issues that transcend just the union movement. When you talk about the minimum wage, Bill, as you know, most of the contracts that are negotiated now, if you're a member of a union, it's above the minimum wage.
Right.
But we also know that if we just worry about just those who are non-union, what you see is what is now taking place, which is that employers and corporations will look for places where you don't have unions,
I used to go to Alabama.
where the labor is cheap, move there and drive down the benefit of working people. Right. And it's not just national. This is why you have this fight over
trade,
global issues, because the capital knows no boundaries. It knows no nationalism.
Well,
it goes wherever it is.
Before we get into these issues, maybe it would be best to devote an entire program on the status of labor and corporations and the issues that are involved. But I'd like to get a little personal, if I may.
Fine.
What was your first job that you were working that became a venue that brought you into the labor movement? And what year was that?
Actually, I came in because I was one of those, what you might call, anti-Vietnam babies. I grew up during the Vietnam War, and I came into it because I thought that it was having a devastating effect upon working people. You had more working people who were being drafted and who were going into the front line. There was a disproportionate amount of blacks going into the military. And we were having this debate about that you couldn't have social programs because you had to have the monies to put into the military.
Guns are better.
And I came up in a generation that said that it was chaotic, it was insane, because you're fighting a war to bring democracy and benefits in a foreign land, and not worrying about the very seeds of destructions which could be planted in this place because of poverty and because of lack of health. So my generation saw a distinction between the war and what it was causing and the effect that it was having upon the American society. So I got very active, and I saw the genesis between what Martin Luther King and what a gentleman by the name of A. Philip Randolph were all saying, that if you really believed in transforming society, the best way was to go into a labor movement and use that labor movement to transform society.
In fact,
and that's what got me started.
In fact, if you look at old film of the March on Washington in 1963, you'll see most of the signs that people were carrying. I mean, there was a lot of different signs, but most of them said, supporting civil rights, member of AFL-CIO.
That's correct. That's correct. In fact, Dr. King said that the individual who fought for civil rights could not be any different than the individual who fought for workers' rights. Exactly. That workers' rights and civil rights were one and the same. That the enemy of blacks was the same individual who also opposed the right of workers to organize. Yeah. And if you were part of a civil rights movement, you had to start by also saying that I have got to be able to determine my own destiny at the workplace. It doesn't make sense for you to say, let me go into a restaurant if you don't have the money to buy the food in the restaurant.
I think Martin King pushed
and that
on
was
that.
King. That was what King was pushing. That was what A. Philip Randolph, one of the pioneers of the American labor movement, who led the march, who threatened Franklin Roosevelt. For those of you who may not know your history, you should look up the name A. Philip Randolph. He was one of the first labor leaders who threatened to bring a march in Washington if Roosevelt did not bring integration to the military and create jobs, equal jobs for blacks in the military.
Right, and to keep any union-busting thugs from breaking up their railroad workers.
He started off the sleeping car porters.
Right.
When porters, in the days when you had trains, it was the only way of transportation in this country, or the primary way of transportation.
No interstates.
He was the one who started it. He's been one of my heroes. In fact, it was he that brought me into the American labor movement. So I started off at the old library, at the Library of Congress, as a worker there. Started off in the union as a steward, then became president of my local.
Which union was it?
It was AFGE 1826. I will forever remember it. 1826 AFGE. Then I subsequently...
Was the let me just interject real quick. Was the government printing office also a part of that?
No, the government printing office was a part of AFGE, yes. Okay. But they were separate from the Library of Congress.
Okay, so continue, I'm sorry.
That's a good distinction, because we at the Library of Congress and the government printing office battled to ensure that the same rights which the Congress were given to the executive branch would apply to their own employees. One of the best kept secret was that all these laws that the Congress passed that applied to everybody else did not apply to the Congress.
I know, they're still doing that on environmental matters.
It does not apply to the Congress, so the discrimination laws and all of those things did not apply to the Congress. So what we used to call the Library of Congress and the government printing office was just a bastion of racism. It was last place where actual racism actually dwelt, was in the Library of Congress and the government printing office.
But you know, the government printing office was notable in that it did have a large number of African American employees.
Yeah, it was, and so was the postal workers. So was the post office, which was also part of the, which was run by the postal by the congressional committee and the postal workers, and all of these were that the only places where blacks, so-called middle class, and if you could actually get a job was in the post office, was in the government printing office, it was in the Library of Congress. Albeit those jobs were low-paying, menial jobs. But in the standards for blacks, that's where you had many middle-class blacks working because they could not work anywhere else in the federal government.
So you got involved in a union at the Library of Congress.
Yes, became its president, and then
That was a local of the AFG.
AFGE, until we had a difference of opinion with our national union back then, and they invited us out of the national union because we took a hard stand against the Vietnam War, and we said you could not have guns and butter. You had to have a choice between guns, and you had to have a choice with butter.
Well, you can see how fast time goes when you're trying to cover a lot of ground here. Maybe just to conclude in this biographical program here, just in a minute or so, you went from a union that was outcast to becoming head of the D.C. Labor Council.
Yes.
In brief, what do you owe your success in being able to get to that point?
While we were, as you call him, an outcast, we had a labor rebel by the name of Jerry Worth, who was head of the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. And there were about 4 or 5 unions who had been kicked out of AFG because of their stand on the Vietnam War. Jerry Worth invited us home. He said, come on. We will not kick you out because you take a position that is different than that of the majority. We just believe in freedom of expression. And if you take a position that you think is right, then you'll express it, and you'll still be at home. So we went into the American Federation of State, County, Municipal Employees. I was there for about 4 years, got a chance to then go to work for the Metropolitan Washington Council as executive assistant to the president, and then subsequently got elected president of the Metropolitan Washington Labor Council for 34 years.
Well, Josh, we're going to continue this in our next program. As you can see, there's a wealth of information from Mr. Williams. We're indeed blessed with his presence and his experience over the years. I'm Bill Schickler with Media Watch on Hunger and Poverty. We'll be having another follow-up program on this, and we'll see you again real soon.
My pleasure.
Thanks again, Josh.
Is that okay?